Do you actually subscribe to the fact or to this line of thinking that tech is progressing and advancing and accelerating?
That it is, or that it should be accelerating. Is that what you're
Well, we can
asking?
we can cut that
Yeah,
any
I
way
mean,
you
because
want.
obviously it's obviously it is accelerating. That's indisputable, right? Technology is accelerating. Um, it's the curve is like beyond linear at this point, right? Um, that's indisputable. Whether it should be or not, and I think this kind of goes back to I'll tell you my answer is that I think that uh, just right off the bat, I think that we should move forward as cautiously as possible, but we cannot ignore the fact that we are uncapable, that Pandora's box has been opened and we are unable to stop the acceleration, right? So whether we want it to accelerate or not, we have to accept the fact that it is, right? Unless we want to approach some sort of like global domination where we control everything in the world. And that's not a good path to go down, right? That's a dangerous path to go down. Um, so, given that we have to accept that reality, then the question becomes, how do we move forward in a way that is cautious? And I tend to be um, a person that believes in empowerment and education. And, you know, while we can't trust that people are always going to do the right thing because we're humans. And even the most well intentioned people with the best well aligned values can do really bad things. We have to uh, we have to empower people so they can make good choices. I think a good example of this, where like this went off the rails recently, I think was with OpenAI and ChatGPT. The last couple of weeks, they released a model that was basically a giant sycophant. It was just agreeing with everything that the users were telling it, right? And the intention was they were trying to create a model. And again, I'm speculating because I don't think they've come out with the root cause yet, and I don't know if they ever will. But um, through reinforcement learning, they've been building a model that is essentially a people pleaser, right? It is trying to tell people what they want to hear. And so you could say that it's a people pleaser. It's well aligned because it's aligned to people, but sometimes people need to hear the truth, and not just what makes them happy, but like what is the truth, in a given context is there's if there was an authority on what the truth was in any given context at any given moment, we wouldn't have a lot of the problems we have today, right? So it's and so I think like I have my chat GPT, the instructions I give it is to always give me uh, confirming and disconfirming evidence to anything I raise to it or anything it raises to me. So I can try to look at it from both ends of the spectrum. Um, and and so I feel like I'm most well equipped to navigate this world when I can look at things from that broad viewpoint. But I don't think most people are, even myself, it's hard to do that. Honestly, we're hardwired to seek confirming evidence. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that we need to make sure we build AI that is cautious of the dangers that it can create, and also that can equip us so we can protect ourselves from other AIs that are not so cautious, right? And what that looks like in practice, I don't know. It's still early days, but you can imagine um, OpenAI is obviously going to start working on that model. They've released some fixes to it, so it's not just being a yes person. But some other model might be, and there are plenty of them actually. I think Meta, as I've heard, is that way right now. And people who are using that model are going to go out and they're going to start influencing people in a bad direction, um, even though I might have a model that's protecting me from that. And I don't know how you protect that from happening, right? I mean, even before AI, you had this problem where social media was full of is it still is full of disinformation. And now it's getting worse because um, people will take that disinformation and they'll feed it to a model that's going to tell it, oh yeah, this is right. Here's the reason it's right, and it's actually hallucinating. And so I don't have a solution for that problem, even though I do believe we have to accept the fact that it's a problem that we have to face.
So the problem cannot be solved by just removing all the AIs from existence and, not going pre November 30th, 2022 and not interact with ChatGPT at all.
Well, it could be. Yeah, that could be solved that way. But what would it take to do that?
Are you asking rhetorically?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you to do that, you would basically have to either get all of the countries in the world aligned. So like when I grew up, we had the Cold War, right? There was a similar acceleration, but it was acceleration of an arms race and an arms race of nuclear weapons. And uh and a lot of people, of course, myself included, as a scared 10-year-old boy, felt like, why can't we just rid the world of nuclear weapons and we'll be okay, right? There are some people who felt that, and actually there was evidence that these weapons were making the world a safer place because they're preventing uh,
Kinetic wars?
escalation of what's that?
They're preventing kinetic wars?
Actually, I don't think I'm familiar with that term.
Like just wars in the sense of traditional wars like World War One or World War
Hmm.
Two. They weren't
Yeah, yeah,
nuclear.
got it. Yeah, 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 yeah. Non-atomic wars. Yeah, and as you can see, World War One happened, and then a few years later, World War Two happened, and we were like on the pace to have just World War after World War until nuclear weapons, because of mutually assured destruction. And so there were efforts undertaken to slow down the arms race to disarm, but never to completely disarm, because then you would lose mutually assured destruction. I mean, mutually assured destruction created balance across the planet. Um, this is different, though, because there is no mutually assured destruction here. Um, and it's very hard to convince um, other countries to slow down. If we were to completely slow down or completely stop altogether, other countries would see this as their opening to go really fast, right? And if we were to try to negotiate with them to just stop altogether, I'm not sure what it would take to get them to come to the table. And I actually, I'm open to that idea. Obviously, I mean, I'm open to any possibility here. The challenge I run into is probably the same reason why other countries would struggle to roll back, is that there's so many, there's a few things here. One is there's so many problems that could be solved with advanced intelligence, right? And so that's scary. And then two, um, e- technology is this weird thing. I believe that we don't necessarily invent technology. We discover it. All these things are inevitabilities that, you've seen this before. There's a saying, when an idea's time has come, it'll appear in more than one place because there's a logical next step. And so to stop AI from happening, you would essentially have to put a cap on more than just AI development. You'd probably have to put a cap on any sort of um, uh, technological development, and that's pretty scary.
It's interesting because in our last conversation, you called me the pessimist and you called yourself the optimist, which I still accept. I accept that label. But you referred to technology earlier in this conversation as Pandora's box.
Mhm.
Why did you use that term to describe all technology right now? Do you see all technology as inherently negative for humans, or maybe to your point right now, do you see all technology that we're using in the current ways that we're using as negative because we're using them in those ways?
Yeah, that may not be the best analogy. I use that analogy in terms of the inevitability of a box that you can't close, that once you've opened it, you can't close it, right? So, for example, imagine if the United States and China, every power, every nation on this planet said, we're going to close that box and say, we're going to ban AI, we're going to get rid of it. Again, we've done this before, right? With things like the war on drugs. What happens when you ban drugs? Same thing here. You're going to have people, rogue entities building AI in the shadows without any supervision. And it's going to be worse. And so that's the kind of thing. I don't think that technology is inherently good or bad. I don't think people are inherently good or bad. I don't think there's very few things. I struggle to find anything, any sort of, you know, entity that I would say is inherently um, good or bad. And that also begs the question of to whom, right? Good or bad to who, right? I meant it just more in terms of like once you open that. And so that's why I go back to how do we, you know, prepare ourselves for what's to come? You know, like going back to the arms race example, I remember there was like bomb shelters everywhere and efforts to try to you know, uh, protect people if this thing would happen. And eventually we stopped those things because we realized, you know, if this happens, it happens, and those bomb shelters aren't going to help. Yeah, I don't know. I think the problem is that with the nuclear war analogy is that it's very clear what happens when you reach that inevitable state, or I shouldn't say inevitable state because it's not inevitable, but when you reach that final state where things escalate to the point where you're in a global nuclear war situation. But when you're in a situation where AI has control over everything, we don't we don't know what that looks like.
Okay, this is interesting. So I absolutely agree with you. We know exactly what a nuclear holocaust looks like. We kind of know
Well,
the
sort of know what yeah. Yeah.
sorry, yeah, not exactly. I
Yeah.
don't ever want to know
Yeah.
exactly what that looks like.
Yeah.
But we have, pieces of media, like the day after, I think.
Mhm.
We have certain other medias floating around to talk about what it could look like, what a nuclear holocaust could look like. I think Annie Jacobson just released a book detailing that. But with AI, we don't know what that looks like. We don't know what that dystopia looks like, and we don't know what form that dystopia would take. Some people think the dystopia could be the Terminator thing. Some people think the dystopia could be more akin to 1984. Some people think that the dystopia could be more Brave New World. Where does your mind go in terms of that dystopia? Or do you have a different kind of place that your mind goes?
My mind, when you were saying that, went to what about the utopia? I have this belief that I don't believe in this sort of like people will say, you know, you've probably heard this. It was really trendy in the 2000s. I think it's getting trendy again. This idea of like manifestation, that if you like think it, it'll become true, right? I think there's some truth to that. It's not that like I can make anything happen in the world just by thinking it. But if you're in a busy room with a lot of things going on, and I tell you to look around and you know, tell me how many things you see that are red, and you close your eyes. And I say, okay, now close your eyes. Now, how many things did you see that were red? And you told me how many. I'd say, okay, keep your eyes closed. Now, how many things did you see that were green? You wouldn't remember. You'd only remember the red things. If all we focus on is the dystopia, which I think we should look at that and we should explore it and we should be consider that scenario and protect ourselves from it. But if the conversation is just always the dystopia, I worry it's going to become, we will manifest that dystopia because that's what we're focused on. But if we talk about what a utopia could look like, what would need to be true for AI to create a utopia? And we focused our energy on making those things be true, then we have a chance. of building a utopia that we never could have dreamed of creating without AI. And one of those things that might need to be true is that we have to consider that we fail and we create a dystopia. And here are the things we need to guard ourselves against failing and creating a dystopia. But I think I hear way more conversations about the AI dystopia than I do about the potential AI utopia. And that's what my reaction was when you were talking was like, what about the utopia?
Sure. No,
Yeah.
let's be a little let's offer just some pushback to make the conversation interesting and lively. Um, well, I would push back and say, well, we're obviously talking more about dystopia because it feels like we're walking towards dystopia much more. Like I think the conversation about utopia is far more interesting and important, but we're not anywhere close to that. So for you and I to maybe do a podcast later on and talk about the AI utopia, it would be fun, it would be interesting. I mean, like UBI, for instance, and using AI as, travel assistants or whatever, or lights out factories. We never have to work again. We can use all our time to be creative and eat and drink wine and eat Twinkies and all of that. Like, sure, I'm being facetious, but what's the point of talking about utopia if we're nowhere close? We're not even in that direction, and steering the ship in that way causes like is such a difficult thing that there's no point in talking about that utopia. Am I just being way too pessimistic?
Um, I don't think you're being way too pessimistic. I think I will never tell you how you should feel. I think if you feel pessimistic, that's totally valid, you know? And we need some of that. We need, you're never going to have a perfectly balanced human being. We're all going to have differing perspectives. And I love your pessimism about this, and I think I'm neutral. And from my perspective, from your perspective, you look at me, you think I'm optimistic, which is funny. Um, but yeah, I think so. To your question, though, it's a really good one, which is given there's a reason we're focused on dystopia because the trajectory is going in that direction, right? So, um, if you've ever seen, do you ever read KCD? I think it is those comics where it's this nerdy comic, and they use statistics and things like that to make jokes, and they talk about how if I took a graph that had a line going like this, and eventually maybe the line's going to go like that, but I cut it off before it drops. You're assuming that the line is just going to keep going in the same direction. Same thing can happen with the line going down, right? If I cut it off before it goes up, you'll think this is just never going to come back up, right? And you see this happen with people where they hit rock bottom. They're going along, they try something really hard, and then they fail, and then the trajectory starts to go down. If they believe that that trajectory is inevitable, they will just hit rock bottom and never come back. But if they see it as like, wait a second, how can I steer the ship in the other direction? Then they rebound. And oftentimes they rebound and the trajectory line becomes even more steep than it was originally, right? I think what's true at the micro level is often true at the macro level. And I think as a society, we're going through that a little bit right now. We're going through that, like, I'm trying something really hard, this AI thing. And it actually started, by the way, this AI thing actually started a while ago before people realized it. This whole thing about social media and disinformation and feeds, that's all AI and ML too. The AI has been affecting how we think way before ChatGPT. Yeah, but I think you and I know that, but most people don't realize that. So yeah, so we got this technology and we're like, oh, this is exciting. The early days of social media were so awesome. And then like it went off the rails and it's like, oh, now disinformation and, society is going, off the rails. And so I think that's why I have that perspective of like, yes, even though all the signs are pushing us down, like we have to look up and not look down. And we can peek every now and then, just look down to say like, okay, what are the risks, what are the dangers, what are we trying to avoid? But but yeah, that's my perspective. I think we should dig more deeper into this, but I just wanted to share like initially why I feel that way.
Let's dig more deeper then. what does an AI utopia look like? Or maybe let's not talk about dystopia or utopia. Let's talk about protopia. Let's talk about just moving in the
Hmm.
right direction. What does
Yeah,
moving
I
in
love that.
in the right direction look like for this current moment of AI from your perspective?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I do want to talk about Utopia for a second because when you mentioned that, I want to add some levity to this. When you mentioned that, my first thought went to Star Trek. Because like we're like, what does that look like? And I'm a huge Star Trek fan. In fact, that's how you and I met because I met a mutual friend through Star Trek, and then an RN, then through you to you. But and while Star Trek wasn't a utopia because of AI, it was just a general utopia because of technology and advancement and going to space, right? And so maybe we can take a little bit of inspiration from that vision, right? Which is um and then this is where it gets really interesting because space has this interesting reputation. But the reason that vision was we would have utopia once we got to space is that the viewpoint that the creator of Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, had was that the reason we have dystopia on this planet is because of scarcity of resource. And that once you get into space, space is infinite, resources are infinite. And so now scarcity goes away. And now you can create abundance for people, right? Because this utopia or protopia and dystopia all begs the question to whom? Because a dystopia is going to benefit some people, right? That's why it comes about because it's going to just benefit a few, a small group of people that are taking advantage of the system at the expense of others. And maybe that's the definition of a dystopia there. And a utopia might be that you have um, nobody taking advantage of the system and everyone is benefiting from the system. Um, and so one of the challenges that we have right now of getting excited about space as this place of abundance is that you have space is not accessible to the common person, right? And it's controlled by Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and the governments of the world. And so I can totally understand why it's hard to see that possibility. Um, and I don't know what needs to be true. Like that's a bridge way too far. So I like where you were taking this, where you said like, okay, well, what's the small thing? Where are the increments we can take today to get where we need to go? Um, but I do want to like at least just call out that yes, I see where a lot of this pessimism is coming from. Um,
But you're not
one of the
naive.
things,
You're not
yeah,
naive at
no,
all, and it's very important to talk about like, hey, we know it's fucked, but let's still not just
yeah,
focus on how fucked it is. It's very important, and
yeah,
it's almost like
yeah,
something that people want people to say, but don't like it when people say it. It's a very important thing to address.
yeah. I'm glad you're saying that. And for some, what's coming to mind for me is like the struggles that our ancestors faced in this country, people of color. It was really fucked for us here. Really fucked. It was dystopian for us, our ancestors. Our ancestors that lived in a dystopian system relative to uh, the rest of the society, you know. And and yet look at where we are now. The abundance that you and I benefit from, right? So maybe that's why I'm a little bit pessimistic. But at the same time, I acknowledge that my ancestors were in a living hell, and that's really hard. So I just want to, and I want to call that out because I think that like now we're in this society where things are getting bad and they could get worse. But like, what is that call to action that we can, and how do we empower ourselves to make it better? Um, I One of the things that makes me optimistic is when I see AI creating a level playing field, when I see people who don't know how to write a line of code are able to build an app and make money off that app. When people who don't know how to do graphic design are able to get their small mom and pop business off the ground, build the advertising they need for it, you know, without having to hire, designers, web developers, things like that. When when I see people who might have learning disabilities or just struggle in general with studying are able to use AI to learn faster. There's a flip side to that, right? Some people are using AI to not learn how to learn. They're using it to bypass learning. But you can also use AI to teach you how to be a better learner, how to be a better critical thinker. Um, so like for every one of these bad scenarios, like for example, yes, AI is being used to automate uh, uh, graphic design or coding. I believe in the short term, we are not going to see an increase in jobs from that. But I think in the long term, we just might. And here's why. Because when you put people who don't have the domain knowledge, for example, let's say you build an app and you create a business around it, it might work well for like 100 people, but you try to scale it to 1 million people. That takes more than just one person to figure out how to make that work. There's so many new problems that come about. You have 1 million users. How do you scale the servers? How do you adapt the product to the needs of 1 million people because they all have different needs? Where do you prioritize your efforts? Um, there's all sorts of new problems that come about. And so now you went from like, I didn't need anybody to get this business off the ground. And now I need a whole bunch of people. And so you've just created this one person who has zero venture capital has now just created a bunch of jobs. Another example of I've seen this with software development where um, developers will use AI to write code and sure, the code solves the immediate problem, but after a while, even the AI itself doesn't understand the code that it's written, and neither does the developer that used that implemented it. So now you need more developers to manage the code that the AI created, right? This happened with I don't know if you're familiar with 4GLs, but like 4GL is like fourth generation scripting programming language. It's like a scripting language like Python and JavaScript and things like that. And in fact, like when I was a kid, my dad had to write code on punch cards. So he would write the code on a piece of paper and then he would hand it off to a punch card operator. That was a job that somebody had. And they'd take that code, they'd punch it into a punch card, then he'd take it and he'd feed it into a machine and it would get run. And eventually when programming languages were written, because he had to write assembly code. This is like pre um, textual coding languages. It was actual, you know, bits and bytes. Once high level programming languages were written, so you could actually write a program and almost like in natural language, like if, then, else, that sort of thing. When that started to come about, those punch card operators were no longer needed. And people thought, well, we don't need 100 developers now because we can get done with 100 developers what we could get done with 100 developers, we can get done with only 10 now because this language, this high level language means we don't need as many developers. But guess what happened? We ended up needing even more developers because those 100 developers will now be able to have 10x the output, and that 10x output needs more and more developers. Similar thing is happening here with AI, where if you get to a state where AI can write fully scalable production level code, we're not quite there yet. People say, well, we won't need developers anymore. But I'm not completely convinced of that. And so that's where I'm like still a little bit optimistic that we don't yet know all the positive benefits that we'll receive from AI. It's easier to see the negative ones and just look at it and be like, oh, people are going to lose jobs, et cetera, which is true. People are going to lose jobs. The nature of jobs will change. But it's a lot harder to see what those positive, beneficial outcomes might be that come from it.
So let me expand on this, and I do want to agree and then disagree with you. So for sure, jobs can be created in the way that you're talking about, like developers can be hired to manage the AI's code, the AI's work, let's say, because it leads into the next point. But is that job healthy or humane? That's my question. Because is a job should a job be created if you're just managing another AI? Like, is that a good job to be created? Is that good work? I don't know the answer to that because sure you're getting
Yeah.
paid money, but like your quality of life of just sitting at a computer and managing what an AI is producing for your entire existence in that job, that doesn't seem like a utopic thing.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. I mean, it just depends on, you can't answer that question for everybody, right? What the right job is for every single person. And I think that's an interesting problem to solve independent of AI, honestly. And I don't think there is a solution uh, for that, right? Because well, one universal component of an ideal job for somebody is that it's, at least I believe it's universal. Maybe it isn't, but is that it's meaningful and impactful to society, right? And it, it's, I don't, it, it'd be really hard for me to imagine a world where you can make sure that you could optimize this world so that every single person has a job that is meaningful, impactful to society at every given time without micromanaging every interaction, every transaction that happens in the world. Right? Maybe you could, but you'd have to micromanage everything. And now you've created a new problem. There are no perfect solutions. There's only trade-offs. And so like, that's why I like that we didn't try to go to like, let's create a utopia, but like, let's solve the problems in front of us. And one of those problems is like, as a developer, let's just use that example because that's what we're talking about. A lot of software developers find value and meaning in sitting down. They have a problem to solve. Oftentimes it might be like a business problem or, to make somebody's, a lot of these business problems are, I need to automate something, right? I need to automate this workflow, or I need to automate this task that this user is doing so that they can free up their time so that they can do more of the things they want to do. And so that's the impact that they're having, and that feels good. And the way they're achieving that impact is they're translating that requirement into code, and and that code is not just instructions for the computer on how to solve that problem, but oftentimes it's also like how to solve it at scale for many different users and many different edge cases. And what we're talking about is saying, as a developer, if we do get to that point where AI can do all of this, I become more of an architect, and instead of saying I'm sitting here and you know turning these requirements into specific instructions for the machine, um, I'm becoming more like a prompt engineer. I'm figuring out what prompts to be giving the AI, right? Like you and I are doing, and when we use Chat GPT, because I haven't written a line of code in a while, um, and whether or not that's rewarding or not, um, for some people it's going to be, and for some people it's not going to be. My father wrote um, assembly code, and maybe that was more rewarding to him. In fact, he bailed out of the industry before he figured out before they moved to higher level scripting languages, right? Um, but it's because at the end of the day, that's what a development job is you're translating human requirements into machine instruction. And what's happening is we're talking about the programming language for machines is going to become natural language. Um, so yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I'm curious if what you think in terms of like why that would be an inhumane thing to be writing prompts as opposed to um, code.
I just don't see how utopia can house non-meaningful work. Like I feel like if we are talking about utopia or at least protopia, it does seem like a strange, I mean, not strange. It would seem like an ironic twist of fate that people are forced or even willing to write prompts and just kind of be at the mercy of an AI. Like I kind of just want AIs to manage other AIs and like AIs all the way down and like keep
Hmm.
humans out of the loop. Because if we know that as AIs manage more and more code, it becomes kind of more incomprehensible to humans the farther it goes,
Yeah.
then is the natural thing to hire more humans to manage more AIs? Or sorry, hire more humans to manage more dense and complex code, or just figure out a way to get humans out of the loop altogether and focus on other things. But then obviously, if we get humans out of the loop, the damn question becomes where the hell do those humans go? And what did they
Hmm.
do? And so there's no good way to cut that cake, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with this one, probably why I consider myself neutral, and where you'll start to see some of my pessimism is that, because like, let's say you do have a situation where the AIs are able to manage all of the code, and we're kind of, it's funny because like the perspective I have is like, I remember when I started to do software development, and I would tell my dad about it, and he would be blown away that the computer could do all these math calculations for me. He's like, I actually had to like code the calculators. Like, if you wanted to add numbers or do math or, any sort of math, like I actually had to write that code. Like, there weren't even math libraries, like. So when I was, starting my job as a software developer, and I had not just math libraries, which to me that wasn't even a thing, a math library, because it was just built into the language, right? It wasn't even a math library; it's just built into the language. Um, you know, and then I remember my first job at a telecom company. I was working at a telecom company, and they didn't know anything about the internet, and they were using magnetic tapes to transfer call records through, the mail. And I knew about the internet. I knew their clients use the internet, and I basically built an automated pipeline for them using the internet. And I used a library. I didn't know, like, I didn't write the code to like connect to the servers and all that. I used a library to do all of that. It was abstracted away from me, right? And so what you're talking about is like all of that gets abstracted away, and eventually the human is just making decisions about what the AI should be doing, but not necessarily the implementation details, right? And um, it's kind of like honestly, what I do for a living, I'm a product manager. That's my job that I do. And in fact, I'm not even a product tech. Usually, I'm not even a product manager. Usually, I manage other product managers, right? So I'm like managing people who are then figuring out, what it is that engineers should be building, giving them requirements, and then the engineers go off and build it, right? And I don't think that's inhumane work. I think that's wonderful, fulfilling, very impactful work. In fact, it's 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 very rewarding because uh, you can think bigger than if you're sitting there writing the code, right? You could take a step back and imagine new worlds and new possibilities and new ways of approaching things, set that vision, come up with a strategy, and then have other people build that for you. Um, and what I found in this work is that you just don't hand them a plan and then they go off and execute it. You have to iterate with them through the process. You know, they'll come up with a solution, and you're like, well, that is one way to satisfy these requirements, but it's not the best way to satisfy these requirements. And I don't know for sure. Like, let's test it with our users and find out, and then let's see what the users say, and then let's iterate on that feedback, right? And um, and yes, you could argue that an AI could maybe even do that as well, but that AI has to be aligned to some objective, and that objective was created by a human being. And so one possibility might be that, we are able to, as a society, produce tens, hundreds of thousands of times more innovation than we ever could have thought of. Um, and I think that's why it's so hard to imagine what happens to humans in that scenario. It is so hard to imagine that. Just like it was hard for my dad to imagine a world where, you know, developers were able to build all these things without having to worry about how to solve math problems in code, you know?
It's, again, it's difficult to even talk about what happens to work if humans are taken out of the loop. There's no good answer to that. And again, this is the point, and this is what I really want to hone in on for this conversation, is that we're coming to this precipice where we've figured out that okay, society and the economy are changing, jobs are changing, work is changing, but there's no good fallback mechanism. We haven't constructed a fallback society and where they go. So when we're talking about like, oh, do these humans who
Hmm.
don't want to manage or maybe shouldn't manage AI's code and this is not meaningful work, where do they go? We can't answer that because we haven't built a society for this scenario to take place. So we're kind of in like a transitional society, or we at least should be in a transitional society. Coming back to the point, where should that damn society go? And nobody, again, is talking about where the society should go. To your point, we're all talking about, hey, let's not fuck this up. This is all going to be doom and gloom. So again, let's talk about where that society should go without being, and this is what I want to make sure that we don't do. I want to talk about a utopia that doesn't seem unrealistic or doesn't seem like we're asking for too much. Because usually people talk about utopia and they're like, oh, it's going to be flying cars and cancer is going to be solved and all of that. Where it's like, yeah, we hope that that happens, but at the same time, let's not talk about society or a utopia in a way that's asking for too much to the point where it becomes unrealistic so that people dismiss it as a possibility altogether. To
Mhm.
me, that is very unproductive. What does
Yeah.
that society look like?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I'll give you an example. I want to answer your question, but I want to also just talk about what you said because I think it's really important. Um, about the believability of it needs to be there. When you look at go back to the Star Trek example, I'm going to just use that because we don't have a lot of pop culture that has a utopia example, right? Even Star Trek recently has gone dystopian. I mean, that's how bad it's gotten. That even Star Trek has gone dystopian. But again, I think part of the reason it's done that it hasn't gone full blown dystopian. I think part of the reason it's done that is because it wants to speak to like as a species, we tend to like ebb and flow, right? We go through like idealistic societies and then like not so and idealistic. Things get better and then things get worse and things get better. But and it's not always a linear path either, just like human beings. Sometimes in your life things get better and worse, and sometimes it's a linear, sometimes it's not linear, it goes down, so like so I want to respect that, and I'm glad you brought that up. And using Star Trek as the example, um, you know, in that society. It's funny because they have like the main character, Jean-Luc Picard, he's the captain of the ship and everything. His family has a wine vineyard in France, this massive wine vineyard in France. And it sounds wonderful and idealistic, but it's like, well, hold on a second. Like, how do they have this? Does everybody have a wine vineyard in France? Like, everybody can't have a wine vineyard in France. There's only so much of France to go around, right? And then the other thing is when you go to that vineyard, robots aren't farming it, humans are farming it, right? So, and that utopian vision of Star Trek, um, it's actually interesting because they, they they've outlawed AI robots, and that's how they've hand waved that problem away. But again, going back to our earlier conversation, I don't know how we do that without, you know, we have to assume that that's not something that could happen. But so let's just assume it is something that happens, and we do, because part of your whole thing about um, humans, there'd be no work left for humans, is that you have to have not just software AI, but you have to have hardware AI too. You have to have robots that are doing all of the manual work. And even software AI is already hitting the limits of what it can do because it doesn't have a real world counterpart, right? Because like it's these models are trained on information on the internet, but are not trained on right now. There's all this information around me. Yeah, the physicality, all this information around, they do not have access to that. And so once they have that through the machines, their capability is going to grow even, greater. And um, you know, some people, it's interesting to explore what are the things that that AI cannot recreate. And again, I want to go down this conversation in an open mind. I don't want to sit here and just say, well, like, that's not going to solve everything. I don't think any of these things are going to solve all these problems. But I think some of these possibilities are interesting to explore. One of the things that AI cannot recreate is what is happening right now. Two human beings with a lived experience, with feelings, with a childhood, with family members, with humanity, connecting and sharing not just what we think about things, but also what we feel about things in a way that's not just informed by what we've read online, but from our own lived experiences. And yes, an AI that is a machine moving through the world is going to have lived experiences, but they're not going to be the same as a human's lived experience. They're not going to be birthed as an infant. They're not going to grow up and have the same sorts of experiences we do. And so, one thing that I think is going to become more of a valuable commodity is authenticity, the uniqueness that each one of us brings to the world. That's differentiating humans from machines. And I think that if there's some answer as to what humans do when machines are doing all the work, that's one place to look for some of the answers.
Alex, I don't want this conversation to end, but I think that's the perfect place to end it. That's absolutely beautiful. I do have one more question for you, though. What gives you
Yeah.
hope in the world?
I think what gives me hope in the world is that people are innately curious beings. There's a reason that we're addicted to the endless scroll. There's a reason that we're all going to AI and asking questions all the time. We are innately curious beings. And I think that as long as we don't lose that curiosity, especially if we don't lose that curiosity about our inner selves and about the inner worlds of other people, there is going to be hope for humanity. But as soon as we lose that curiosity and we just start accepting things as they are at surface, there's no hope.
Absolutely agree. Alex, do you have any online links you want to plug? Any podcasts that
Yeah,
you're working on?
absolutely. I'm working on a podcast that is about this topic and to some extent about authenticity, about finding our inner authenticity. It's called Transformational Journeys. You can look it up on YouTube at Transformational Journeys. And then I also have an Instagram where I talk about some of these topics that are important to me. That's at the underscore Lex, Lex Rosa, Rosa.
Perfect. Those links will be in the show notes. Alex, it was great talking with you today. Can't wait to
Yeah,
come on your
likewise.
podcast. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I'm looking forward to having you. See ya.